Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this special panel discussion for this year's online Féile and Phobail festival. My name is John Barry. I'm a recovering politician and professor of green political economy at Queen's University, Belfast. And tonight's discussion is around the lessons that we may be able to learn from the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis that we're all still living through, and what we can learn from this crisis and how we've reacted to it as citizens and as states in terms of addressing the planetary emergency. I mean, part of the inspiration behind my suggesting to Féile for this panel was reflecting on that old John Mitchell, statement about the famine, that the Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English caused the famine. And is there a similar issue we can say in terms of global capitalism encroaching ever more on wilderness areas caused the virus, but actually it was the disastrous in some places reactions of national capitalism in England and in the US that caused the pandemic. So that's part of my interest in kind of looking at the political economy dynamics of what's happening here. But also, and I'll just end and introduce our panel, but to see how this crisis is also an opportunity for change. There's a lot of discussion now we see, certainly on social media, in policy circles and political circles, of building back better. Can we see that as we respond to what I would suspect we're heading into a depression, not a recession? I think we're looking at a major economic scarring, which I really worry for, particularly in terms of our younger workers and members of our community. But as we head into that, can we start thinking about putting in place policies, ideas that we're not going back to normal? My own view is that normal was the problem. Normal was unsustainable. Normal was, inequality producing. So I'm joined tonight by three guests. We have Claire Bailey, MLA for South Belfast and leader of the Green Party in Northern Ireland. We have Chris Hazzard, Sinn Féin MP for South Down. And then finally, Stiofan O'Neill from Belfast Trademark, and also a prominent trade unionist here in the north. So if I could begin with you, Chris, what do you think are the connections between the two C's here, COVID and capitalism?
Well, good evening, John. Thanks for the invite to take part in the panel. Yeah, I suppose despite Donald Trump's language of describing the virus as the Chinese virus and all the xenophobic and jingoistic tropes that come along with that, I think there's no denying that COVID-19 is of human creation. I think we are responsible for the crisis because of the planetary system we have created and maintained, namely globalized financial capitalism. I think the COVID-19 pandemic exposes the very eco-colonial features of the system and the huge catastrophic impact that it has on the natural world, primarily due to the parasitic and predatory search for maximum profits, no matter the human, social or ecological consequences. I think at the very heart of that is the endless intensification of animal agriculture. To some, it's a controversial thing to say, although I think it is becoming more and more apparent that the rapid marketization of animal, especially wild animal and plant products, is driving us towards this situation. Each year it's said that the global food system colonizes more than 13 billion hectares of forest area for animal agriculture. So, in the last 25 years alone, an area larger than the South American continent has been sacrificed then to meet the needs of the industry. So many of the pathogens that have been held in check by long evolved forest ecologies have been let loose. They've been sprung free to threaten a highly globalized and connected world. We've seen that once the pandemic started to make its way across the world. So I think the thing to point out here too, which is important, that then at the front line of this very often is many impoverished indigenous communities who very often feel the brunt of these diseases such as Ebola, HIV, SARS, and now COVID-19 when they're sprung free. Indeed, I've seen lately that I think 70-75% of all new diseases discovered in the last 30 years have originated in animals. Thankfully, I think the conversation is now opening up, which is important in this regard, in that, you know, mainstream voices have, by and large, failed to join or to see the linkage between the political and economic existence of ourselves in the natural world. Although I do think that's starting to change now.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Claire, do you have anything to add?
I think there's loads there, many touched on by Chris. I think really, for me, what has been exposed is how fragile our system is. And when we look at that whole interconnectedness at a global level, and we watched how fast and how far this virus spread, shows you how connected that is at a global level. But when we work that down into a more local level, I think what both your two C's, your COVID and capitalism, is really exposed to, suppose, a stark reality of how not just our societal, but also our economic systems are operated. So we've also here within the UK, we've come through hard years of austerity, and you know the impact that has had on local communities, on job security, on workers' rights, for example, has been really, really severe. And here we are facing the next big crisis. We also, let's not forget, we're just sitting in July right now, but at the start of this calendar year in 2020, we were watching Australia burn. We were watching those forest fires raging right across the world, followed very, very swiftly by huge floods that were devastating parts of England in particular. We were seeing heat waves and weather patterns shifting here as well. And all that has an impact on the local, not just the economy, but that society structure. And now we have COVID, and this is all in very, very short spaces of time. So I think what we're really looking at the minute is it's nearly like a triple emergency crisis that we're really crunching into. So we've got COVID, which is providing the health crisis. We've also got an economic crisis that, again, this boom and bust system of capitalism that we have sustained for such a long time is now facing. And you're absolutely right, we're probably looking into the Great Depression rather than another recession or austerity plan, and then the climate crisis on top of that, which is set to just really dominate in terms of the impact on our lives, much more than we've ever seen before. And that will be, again, at the global level, but very, very much so having local impact. So that triple crisis that we're facing, I don't see, and I can't see a way in any scenario that it could be dealt with or solved within the current capitalist system that we continue to operate under. And we have to start looking at new ways out of this. And even the economic response to the COVID crisis, when we look at what many Western governments in particular have done, in terms of being able to step in and maybe furlough staff or pay 80% of your wages, or how that's all been managed, has been done not with the worker in mind, but with business in mind. So employers have been given these subsidies and these packages to then, mete out to their staff. So where's the workers' rights in this? And I think just situations and responses such as that has really, really highlighted the insecurity of workers' rights, of the self-employed, for example, and how hard it has been for them to try and get some sort of bargaining power in here to be heard. And I think that just all this has exposed how fragile that we are, but I think that we really need to shift now and look at that triple crisis that we're facing and what we can do to really move ourselves forward and provide some sort of sustainability at the other end of that.
Thanks, Claire. That's a nice link perhaps to Stiofan. I mean, I think, Claire, you've highlighted the multiple vulnerabilities that this crisis has exposed. As I was saying to my brother, who's a busman in Dublin, well, we know who's a key worker now, Jared, and it isn't a well-paid university professor. So it's amazing how these key workers now, often very gendered, as Claire would, certainly now you've spoken out on this in the past in terms of low-paid, precarious workers, and now the most vital ones. But Steve, could I just turn to you, just that issue that Claire was mentioning in terms of workers' rights, but also if you have any thoughts on this connection between the origins of the crisis as rooted in some ways in globalised and globalising capitalism.
Yeah, after those two introductions, I feel I should tell a joke or something to lighten the mood. I'll go along with the theme, because we've started down that road already. I think that the COVID thing, very briefly, it kind of revealed but also concealed things about capitalism. That's the important thing. It revealed, yes, lots of about the integrated, interconnected nature of the world, the globalized nature of capital, how when one bit fails, other bits fail up the supply line. Those things became very clear to us. And there's something to learn from that, it's emperor's new clothes time. The contradictions in this system are really, really obvious. But we had this 12 years ago with the global financial crash, when the emperor was bollock naked, and we all pointed at it, and we thought this is a great opportunity now for the left to win power and to change the globe. And nothing happened. In fact, I would argue that capital is now more powerful than it was 12 years ago. So we might have another opportunity to point out the inadequacies of this system. But whether we're politically ready and politically capable of organising for power is entirely another matter, and we've seen that over the various elections. I know there are good stories around places of left-wing parties and movements and social, but broadly speaking, we're in a kind of weak position. The other bit that's concealed, the COVID has concealed, is that in the last week of February, the 2020 predicted global financial crash had started, and COVID's kind of concealed that bit of this system that global financial instability was a real thing, and it will be a real thing when we get out of this kind of current crisis. I think it was Google and eBay and some of the largest corporations in America last week in February dumped about 15 to 20% of all of their shares because they were getting rid of assets because they knew there was about to be a collapse in the stock market. And when we get out of this, actually what's going to happen is that those same companies are going to find this is a fantastic opportunity now to kind of sweep in and buy up all of those distressed assets and distressed firms and thousands of SMEs that are going out of business. So we have to remember that too, that this is actually a really good opportunity for capital. And I don't think we're ready on the left actually to take it as an opportunity for us. So my concern is that, yes, we have to kind of critique the system, understand how it works better, but I'm also worried about us winning political power because, even if we win political power in parliaments across Europe and the world, that doesn't necessarily translate to who owns into production, who owns our utilities, who makes these decisions about, about growth and degrowth and what we dig out of the ground and what we leave in the ground. So I don't know if it answers the question, but the issue there is it concealed a lot and it revealed something, but both, I suppose. In terms of workers' rights, so it's great, really, I suppose, in the sense of David got bullshit jobs. And a lot of people are sitting at home, me included, going, fuck, that might be me. I might be in one of those bullshit jobs because there's an awful lot of people who are low-paid, insecure, precarious, who are keeping the whole place together. And a lot of those neoliberal bullshit jobs, which have been created by this kind of outsourcing, privatising when the furlough was over in October.
Thank you. Chris, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think Stevie raises a really good point around what it is also concealed as well as everything else. And again, it's probably through the medium of the likes of Stevie and the guys at Trademark and others who've been talking about this of late and pointing out the fact that, the global debt bubble is bigger, than any time in living memory. It's something like $250 trillion at the minute. Much of it corporate debt. When you consider, for example, the Boeing owes $37 for every dollar that it earns. It shows you the prevalence of zombie firms, etc. at the minute. The global south was already in deep recession long before anybody mentioned COVID. Many of those countries getting buried under unnecessary historical debt, amounting to somewhere in the region of $11 trillion. I think one of the conversations that must be had at the minute is recalibrating how we do things with regards to cancelling debt. Even the IMF and the World Bank have started to talk about suspending debt payments and all the rest of it, but that just pushes the problem further down the line. We do need to have a serious conversation about how do we get the likes of reparations and cancelling debt onto the table for a conversation. And the big thing, I suppose, for those of us in Europe is coming to terms of the damage that the Stability and Growth Pact, and I know it's up for review if European Union ever get around to it this year, but we often find, when you speak to people, they seem to think that they're sitting in an ivory tower in Europe and that everything is rosy in European economies. Italy's gone through its fifth recession since the 1990s. German economy, export-driven economy at that as well, is also teetering. There's sluggish performance right across the Eurozone bloc. And much of it is due, certainly I believe, to the fact that this Stability and Growth Pact has such a negative impact upon society. And I know, GUI NGL had done some work in Emma Clancy, obviously. Some of you guys will know, had pointed out that 63 times in the last number of years, the Commission has directed member states to either cut spending on their healthcare or open it up to private forces. So, we have big problems here to deal with, which have been concealed, as Stevie says. They were coming down the tracks anyway, and this has just multiplied the efforts that we have to do now in the years ahead.
Just before I let Claire in there, I mean, it is something that perhaps we should have a whole discussion on, that the issue you raised, Chris, about the fiscal and monetary constraints that have been imposed upon those members of the Eurozone in terms of their ability, the maneuverability of states to raise capital, to spend money, and so on. That's something I want to come back to towards the end and let Stevie in on this. But Claire, you want to come in there?
Stevie brought up an interesting one. This happened just back in 2007 with the financial crash. We had this big economic crisis. What did we get out of that? And I think that there's a huge learning to be had in that one, because what we've seen in terms of the state and economic response, the capitalist response to that, was quantitative easing. But all the money that was then produced was put back into the system, but it was put back in without condition. It was not sort of that, we will bail this out and you will do this in return. It was just this free-for-all of money that was produced in order to save the system. And I too feared that, that we might not get, that the left, I suppose, isn't ready to capitalise, for want of a better word, on the opportunity that perhaps exists now. And we're looking at building back better, going right back into who are these key workers, what are our essential services, what is it that we value in order to keep the wheels turning, I suppose. And we need to be having a look at that. What is this? Are there ideas out there on more modern monetary theories, for example? How can we reconfigure all of that? But we just have to look at who has the power and who has the means of production and who has the control, I suppose, at the minute. And that is where the real big concern is, because, Trump has been mentioned. Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings also give me huge reasons for concern as well, when we see, while we're dealing with this COVID emergency and the pandemic, what this government sitting in London is doing is really quite extreme stuff. We're looking even at PPE contracts, for example. I think that there's hundreds and hundreds of contracts been given out to them, but we're not allowed, and we can't be told, or we are not seeing where all this money's going to. And I think that there's many exposés out there. We're hearing, of one company whose assets were of £19,000 being awarded £108 million contract, for example, and that's now being judicially reviewed in our courts. These types of economic responses. So you just have to look at what the government or those with the power are doing to either realign or just redevelop themselves into keeping this power and keeping this control, and how we maybe on the left or elsewhere need to be able to work something better, come together to demand a Build Back Better.
And I'll just bring in Stiofan on this point, in terms of one of the advantages the UK has is being outside the Eurozone. It has a sovereign currency, and it has particularly one major tool in its box of recovery, strategies that it is refusing to use. And just as a way of introducing Stiofan on this point, it's the whole idea of either, I call it public money or modern monetary theory, in terms of providing a solution, providing the financial resources to be able to employ people, to be able to build back better and engage in that infrastructural build. But Stevie, do you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I was really hoping you weren't going to ask me about modern monetary theory in a 45-minute fucking podcast.
I want the shortened version, Stiofan.
Throwing me under the bus. Well, I'll relate it back to what Claire just said there about 2008. Even though the contradictions in capitalism were really obvious to everyone, including the people in the system, is that the lesson from it was that they won the narrative of that. Because although we could see that it was the fault of finance capital, the winning narrative, if you ask anyone, if you go into a pub and ask a bloke with no arse in his trousers what the problem with the economy is, he'll say, we ain't got any money. We spend too much in the good times. And that narrative has become so embedded in people's sort of psyche that it's really hard to break people out of that. And just as that narrative became repeated about we've got to balance the books, we have to shrink the public services, we have to, all that kind of the economy is like the household. We have to not spend what we don't have, and that led, of course, that legitimizes austerity, and you can hear it already happening on the press. It's everywhere now, all over the press and the media, that they've started to say the same again. Well, who's going to pay for COVID? And we're back to the idea that the state doesn't have any money. And of course, you only have to pick up the Financial Times without getting into any too depths about this. Andrew Bailey's admitted that they can literally, and are all of the time anyway, printing money and creating new money. And now it depends where that money goes and how that's money spent and what it's used on. Because Keynes said back in the 30s when Roosevelt was doing something similar, he says, buying a big lie and that everything's going to grow and we're going to have a great economy, you have to be careful what you invest that money in. At the moment, as Claire said, most of that money is going into corporate tills, it's going into capital, it's going into prop up what Chris said, zombie firms that can barely pay the interest on their capital. I think the OECD said 10% of all companies in the OECD are zombie. They're dead, walking dead. And so if I was in the executive and if I had a say, I'd be over to knocking on number 10 or number 11 saying, see that direct monetary finance you're engaged in, see that creation of new money out of nothing. Can we have some of it, please? Can we have $1 billion or $2 billion over here? Because that is literally what they're doing at the moment. I mean, they're literally creating new money out of nothing. But instead of spending it constructively in our economy, in our recent economies, they're giving it, as Claire said, back to the corporate sector to prop up firms that are dead. And you don't have to go to a more monetary theorist kind of economist. You just have to listen to what Andrew Bailey, the head of the Bank of England, is talking about. He's admitted it. That's what they're up to.
And just as the academic in me would point the audience to a Bank of England report from 2014, which basically admitted this, that it's really the essence of what Stevie's talking about here. It's so important, but also so counterintuitive. And it's essentially this, folks. The state does not have to tax before it spends. As a currency issuer, it brings about the existence of money by spending to get things going. And I think that's certainly worthy perhaps for another Féile discussion. But I want to move on now.
Just quickly, John, there's a great quote this morning, but I know you're a fan of Stephanie Kelton, and MMT is problematic, and we haven't got time to get into it now, but the lie that there is no money is just that. It is a lie, and it's a neoliberal myth that we really need to start questioning. But Stephanie Kelton said, she responded to ABC News this morning, they said that the federal government incurred the biggest monthly budget deficit in history in June, to which she replied, alternatively, the federal government just made a large deposit into the US economy. And that's what state spending is. State spending is a deposit into the economy, but it depends on what you're spending that money on. If you're spending it on a just transition and a Green New Deal and green jobs, also that benefits everybody. But they're not. As Claire said, they're giving it back into corporate capital, where it will be speculated again and where they'll swoop in and buy up distressed assets next year.
Although I wonder if I could come in there, John, just on a very small point. I wonder, has the narrative changed? Does the public now buy that stuff about there's no magic money tree? I think there's a general consensus now when people look at it and when they see the different actions that were taken. I think, unlike maybe 2008 to 2010, that period, I think there is a realisation now in the wider society that there are alternative ways to do that, and austerity was a political choice. So I do think there's a moment now, although you see it and you will still see people working away in the background, the trend. And this is where I actually think, Anne Pettifor drew the analogy back to the end of the First World War when John Maynard Keynes obviously had presented his public path to European recovery, and Wilson basically scoffed at it, but it was because Wilson's economic advisor at the time was Thomas Lamont, obviously the chief executive of JP Morgan. There was no reason. That was the reason why, obviously. And I think there will be people in the background now trying to build the case. And we see it in the South, as we see it in Britain and everywhere else, to go the private finance route. But I think the public will ask for alternative ideas. I also think one of the things that will make the establishment think again is the rise in recent years of the far right and certainly populist nationalist movements. And they will understand that they need to be very, very careful in the years ahead.
I do hope both of you are right. I mean, it's always been the case. Why is it there's always money for war, but not for health and education? And I'd like to think that that's a simple way for people to start understanding these issues. I want to move on now, though, and I'm going to bring Claire in on this. I mean, most people listening, or even perhaps those on the panel here, may not realise that we're living in a state or stateless. The Northern Ireland Assembly declared a climate and ecological emergency. Lots of councils across the north and the south and England. But these, political declarations like the Dáil has declared an emergency, the British Parliament, the French. But it seems to me that the pandemic is what a real emergency looks like. That's if we are really being true to the rhetoric of these declarations of emergencies, that what we're seeing in terms of social distancing, people staying at home, being asked to wear face masks and so on. These are the types of things that we'd expect if we wanted to really tackle the emergency. So I'd like to ask Claire, but I'll just start with you and go to everybody else about what lessons do you think we can learn from how particularly states and citizens have reacted to the pandemic, and what we can, read across or learn from that in terms of addressing the much bigger, let's be under no illusion, the pandemic, horrible as it is actually going to be small beer in comparison to the impacts of climate breakdown. So Claire.
I think that probably the most noticeable that I had, and probably the most impressive as well, that I seen there was that people reacted quicker than those in power. When we start talking about lockdown measures or taking this seriously, or stay at home, stay safe, wearing masks, wearing gloves, that people went into lockdown before they were told to. People were able to access information through the internet or technologies or whatever way they get their media. But people informed themselves, and they did that really, really quickly, and then they reacted, and then we've seen the state response follow that. And I thought that for me has been a really impressive thing to see happen, and that's the bit that I think that we need to be able to continue empowering people into what they do, how they handle it, and how they want to come out of this, and what they want to see at the other end. And whether that be through the Build Back Better or the Green New Deal, so a health emergency and the health crisis can be dealt with through the actions that we are taking, and hopefully a vaccine can be found, but we will learn to live with COVID in whatever shape and form it develops itself into. Economic crises, we are completely seasoned with those as well. We live in a boom and bust culture. Since I've been born, there's always been boom and bust. So economic insecurity, whether you like it, and we can discuss it at great length all the time, is there, and is something that we do know. What we don't realise yet is the climate impact, is the climate crisis and the emergency that will bring, and how deep and how far that this is going to go. So I think that that's the real key message to be able to get out there as well, is how do we put all this together? How can we use where we are now? How can we watch and see how people reacted so quickly and so willingly to help each other, to help their communities, to help their neighbours, to save their families? How can we keep that going and move forward in, I suppose, a carbon-free society next? How do we set up an economic system, an ecosystem, I suppose, that benefits us and has the greater good in there as well? And that's not going to be about basically feeding money back into the corporate sector to then continue these ownership structures where we move from a fossil fuel based energy system, for example, into a hydro one, just because hydro is cleaner. Because if the system doesn't change with it, then the change doesn't come for people. And I think that that's really, really key. We've seen people take the ownership, and I don't want to see them lose that again. So that's been the most impressive. I think that's where your question was coming from, John, is in how do people, how did the reaction go to that one? So I have been hugely impressed that people have taken ownership with this. How we all communicate now, working from home, it's, as nice as it might sound, is also a very, very stressful place to be. Can be really quite isolating. So where do we find those new social ways of being? That connectedness needs to come back again, and those conversations need to happen. So there's a whole lot. I forget your question, but I'm hoping the answer is a wee bit.
No. You have touched upon the importance of seeing, particularly by and large, people have reacted positively. Yes, we've seen some isolated incidents of people acting the maggot and so on. Mostly people have seen that a lot of these new habits we've learned are not necessary to protect ourselves, that to protect other vulnerable people in our community. And I think that's certainly been something I've taken home from what's going on. But before I let you in, Stevie, on this, what lessons can we learn in terms of addressing the planetary crisis, just to pick up on one thing you said there, Claire, and it's always slightly irritated me that we use this language of the Green New Deal when actually we should be just calling it a green jobs strategy, because I think the New Deal really only has resonance, I think, in the American context with the New Deal and so on. And I think there's kind of a trick being missed there, because I think for a lot of people say, what the hell is a Green New Deal? Jobs they get or employment and so on. But I know that's now become the kind of industry standard about how we describe this. And the other thing, just before I let Stevie in, and just in terms of one lesson I've certainly picked up, is there a way we can repurpose the flattening the curve image? It's something that certainly at the early part of the lockdown, we all seen and understood the stretching out of the peak so that the NHS wouldn't be overcome. Actually, as an aside, though, it was the care homes that we missed out on in terms of being focused purely on the NHS. But can we use that idea, that simple idea of flattening the curve to bending the curve down, and the curve in this place being greenhouse gas emissions, as a way to communicate to people why we're asking them, to change their lifestyles, to, shift to different ways of transportation to help combat climate breakdown. But Stevie, anything else beyond what myself and Claire have picked up in terms of lessons to be learned in terms of tackling the planetary crisis?
Yeah, well, very briefly, I suppose that the two big ones, Claire's mentioned both of them, so I don't want to repeat what she said, but you have on the one hand bold state intervention, and that's a crucial dynamic and important lesson in this, the idea that we go away from that pointless to useless neoliberal kind of idea of, private good, public bad. The pandemic has been, our lives, if you like, have been secured by bold state intervention, and we're not going to deal with climate breakdown without bold state intervention again. And yes, I'm going to talk about state central planning. The idea that the state doesn't centrally plan, the idea that the state isn't there somehow in the background directing the economy. Of course it is. We just need a state that directs the economy to us and to our communities and to our environment. So the issue of bold state intervention is one we need to get back onto the table again. And the other issue linked to that, of course, as Claire said, is the strength of collective action at a local level. And it's linking those two together. The kind of principle at the heart of them is collective action. The principle at the heart of them, as you said, John, is care for each other. I mean, I know that I cannot secure my children's future on my own. I can only secure my kids' future if Chris promises to secure my kid's future, I'll promise to secure his kid's future. That's how this thing works. And so those ideas and those values have to be placed front and centre back into economics and how economic system is structured. And that means looking at ownership structures. That means looking at economic democracy. It means looking at privatisation, outsourcing, PPPs, and all of the different ways in which we've handed over control of our economy to tiny groups of individuals, oligarchs and shareholders, and indeed individuals themselves that own under capitalism, one person, his name's Bezos, could literally own the entire frigging planet. We could allow that to happen. It's possible in this system for that to happen. So for me, linking state intervention and collective community action, and through the kind of lens of economic democracy, is where we have to go from here. But I'll go back to my first point of the day. We'll only ever do that if we win political power, of course. So that's the real big hurdle. And there are a couple of really good models I'm happy to talk about if we have time at the end about community wealth building and some ideas that are coming in which are really, really useful in how you connect the states with local communities in ways that are kind of supportive of each other.
Well, I'd like to think we could come back to that, because certainly the work going on in Preston and now South Ayrshire are quite inspiring in terms of localised responses. But Chris, I'd like to bring you in on this issue, whether or not you can see any lessons that can be learned, strategies that can be developed from responding to the pandemic and how we address climate breakdown.
Yeah, well, the guys have covered, to a large extent there. What I would add perhaps is, and again, I've picked this up in conversation with lots of people, is that this pandemic, this emergency, is probably showing a spotlight on long-standing employment issues and the overarching area of the world of work. I know you don't like the language of it, but certainly I would argue that now is the time to really start a conversation about a new deal for workers, to look at a social contract. Far too often when we hear government spokespeople or whoever it might be, the media talking, we hear about economic growth, we hear about the economy. You rarely hear about building a society that the economy's built to serve towards. We've known for some time that workplace automation has obviously created an increasing technological advances, is creating traditional issues with alienation of workers. But I think the overall global financial capitalist system is driving that even faster in recent years. I think that has come to the fore in recent months. People are alive to that, are awake to that. But certainly, I would make the case. The party we make the case. We've reached a point long overdue where we need a reinvigoration of trade union movement, collective bargaining rights. You only have to look in the Dublin High Court in recent weeks that have struck down legislation about protecting workers' rights. The Debenham workers, of course, coming out. And again, you see the situation with the Debenham workers where liquidators will prioritise the needs of commercial partners over the protecting workers. And too often that has been the case. And I just think we're in a moment now where people understand that, they're ready for that conversation. And I think it brings to light some of the stuff that Stevie talked about earlier with regards to power, and I agree wholeheartedly. When we look at power, we need to question why, for so many on the progressive side of politics, have fallen into this world of electoralism, where electoralism is the priority, and I think we need to look at collective action, political education. I know again the guys at Trademark have been flagging this up in recent times. And the failure in that regard, I think, goes a long way of explaining the failure of the left in the post-2008 era. I think it's only whenever you coalesce and when you find people on movements and political parties and independent media and community organisations coalescing around these ideas and campaigns that we have any sort of chance of challenging and challenging the power and the mainstream elite and building alternative societies and the way that we do that. I think we have to seriously look at the failure of both. Even if you look at Sanders and the Corbyn movements, they didn't come close to electoral power, never mind power and changing society. And the failure of Syriza and others to transform society when they get in. We have to reflect on that and we have to see, what can we do better going forward. But I think there is a generation now who are ready and willing to have that conversation and to work together.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. I want to begin to start winding up our conversation and try and leave our listeners on a positive note. And as Stevie said at the start, mother of God, I'm going to tell a joke here, given how depressing. The reality is what we're talking about here is deeply existentially depressing, particularly those of us who have children. It's certainly what motivates me in terms of a lot of my activism and public speaking on this topic. It's not just an intellectual issue. This is an issue that threatens our kids' and grandkids' future. But what suggestions, I'll start with you, Claire, suggestions you would have in terms of, practical strategies, policies that you would advocate as the way to build back better and to prevent us going back to normal. So let's start with you, Claire.
Thanks very much. I suppose leads on from what we were talking. In my experience, I know that a lot of weight is put on political power and having that influence to be the decision makers. But in my experience, I have rarely, if ever, seen politics leading. I think more often it follows. So it will follow from grassroots movements, from that collective bargaining, I suppose, of the people put the issues on the table, and then politics, if you want to get elected, have to take it up. And that's where you get your votes, and that's where you get elected too. So what I would love to see the younger generation being able to capitalise on at the minute is the power of themselves and the power of what they want as a movement to be on the table. We look at what Greta Thunberg was able to achieve as one young girl sitting outside a building has now turned into a global movement. The impact locally here was that the last elections that we had was, I suppose, the first where I was out knocking doors and I didn't have to sell climate or a green, you call it a jobs deal, or any of that to the majority. They were telling me, because their kids were now being taught it in school. So you want to go back to the old mantra of education, 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 have the conversations and allow the younger or the next generation the space to come in and take this over, because their agenda is very, very different from what ours has ever been. And I think that one, again, links back to looking at that response to COVID in the wider public, where they completely got it and they acted immediately and they looked after each other and their communities. And you know, that is there. That is a palpable sense of we achieved that, along with this whole movement that, you know, the climate emergency is now way too big. We need to act now. We can't wait for politics to do this, because I just said politics isn't going to do it. But what they will do is react to the mass demands, if they want to hold on to power. So it's that reversal, and I think that that's what I have tried to put across, not just to my own kids, but to others that I've been speaking to about now. You know, in crisis, there is always opportunity. Look for that opportunity and do not let it go, because it's probably going to be right now, with this triple crunch that's going on, probably the most powerful opportunity, certainly in my lifetime anyway. I'm not going to say in there because there's many crises to come for them, but to seize that opportunity and to march on with it, to be the leaders, and don't expect something to be done for them just because it makes sense in your head. Doesn't mean somebody's going to do it for you. So I think that that's the one that we really need to be feeding right now.
I mean, I think you're absolutely 100% clear on the issue of education, but we also need agitation and organisation, the old slogan of the International Workers of the World, the wonderfully named Wobblies. But Chris, I'm going to come to you now, just in terms of, you know, your, you know, proposals, ideas, strategies about, you know, particularly because, you know, certainly as many of us have, we probably supported some of our young citizens, particularly in the ones involved in the Youth Strike for Climate. And for a lot of them, they're suffering from climate anxiety. There is a sense of, they really feel scared about the future, and there's a sense of hopelessness. So what are the sources of hope, strategies and policies that you think, Chris, we should be focusing on?
Well, again, I go back, and Claire's right to flag up political education, and you know, it's absolutely vital going forward. And because to a large extent we are fighting similar battles, if not the same, from previous generations and times gone by, and people need to have the skills. We need to stop refighting old battles. I think we need to look at greater international solidarity. I think there's a great opportunity for that. Like, for example, you know, there's a lazy narrative among some elements that, you know, certainly in the global north, that the institutional organisations, IMF, central banks, all the rest of it, are giving governments the space to be able to run up debt to help economic stimulus and all the rest of it. But they're suffocating and starving the global south. You know, the Ghanaian finance minister spoke recently that, you know, when he used the emotive language of George Floyd and saying that we can't breathe, you know, yous are being allowed, rich countries, he says, are being allowed the space to be able to run up debts. We're being held to, you know, structural adjustment and deficit payments and all the rest of it. You know, South Africa at the minute is being hammered. We see what's going to happen in Latin America currently. I think there is a moment and a time for international solidarity, and I think that time's now. We mustn't forget that there is a huge number of geopolitical hotspots at the minute developing, haven't gone away. I think it's an absolute scandal what's going on in the West Bank in Palestine. I think, you know, we need to be able to stand up on all of these, and I think there's an opportunity. You know, much like maybe, you know, the 1930s, yes, there was a dark period in time, but people of progressive shades came together and they realised that. If you look at the work of, you know, and you've mentioned the likes of Preston City Council and Cleveland, Ohio, Barcelona and Camus, and it demonstrates what can be done. And for me, one of the big advantages, especially in Barcelona, what they've been able to do is bring in our food systems to talk about all of this. Simple things that we can do, not just as individuals, but as societies and local communities, to be able to have a massive impact. And a large thing for me in all of this has been, up until now, you know, talk of a Green New Deal, talk about climate change, it has appeared so abstract, so difficult, so big to be able to deal with. But I think the last 6 months or so has demonstrated not only is it feasible that governments can do this, but societies can actually act in the interest of all of us. And that we can do it, and the time is now to do so.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. Can I come to you finally, Stiofan, in terms of your proposals of strategies, sources of hope, of action that you think we need to grapple with?
Yeah, one of the things we did post-2008 largely because we were depressed as, dealing with sectarianism as an anti-sectarian group. It was kind of negative. It was really depressing, actually, that we decided to set up cooperatives, cross-community co-ops. There was no real logic to it. It didn't really make much sense in the worst, recession in 80 years. But since then, it's become something a lot different and a lot bigger. And the one thing we learned about that is that when you build collective democratic spaces, it gives people hope. And that's kind of my learning from that. So when you talk about younger people, when younger people are having climate anxiety, and my own kids suffer it as well, and never stop talking about it, you have to give them something to see that's working now. And so there's an idea about building the future now, about bringing these kind of utopian ideals and actually making them work in and around us. And I know that building small democratic spaces doesn't defeat capital, but at least it gives something for people to see and to feel hopeful about. And that's really, really important, I think, because of the kind of nature and extent of the existential crisis. I know that this Belfast City Council was doing work recently, some of the other local government places here, about on community wealth building, that kind of new approach to how local government spends its money, and if it spends its money, it just spend it, in local SMEs or local co-ops, which should help develop those co-ops, as opposed to just giving the money away to the usual gang of kind of corporate players that are there. When I'm not going to name them all, but they're all there with their hand in the till of the public sector. But community wealth building is really useful because it's kind of sticky capital. The money stays where you spend it. It circulates around those communities. It reduces inequality. It builds wealth. It employs people, and it gives people a say and a role in their communities. And it builds those communities. So I think there's loads of work to be done there. One of the problems with community wealth building, and the people who brought these ideas to us, CLES, which is kind of what are they called again? The National Organisation for Local Economies, who work in Preston. They work in Ayrshire. Ayrshire's just begun a massive programme of community wealth building. With the help of the Democracy Collaborative, that kind of American outfit who have been promoting that work, as Chris mentioned, in Cleveland and places, and all the rest of it. Is one of the biggest problems we have is neoliberal groupthink in our institutions. I mean, we need to really, the people who run our institutions here, I've been at meetings where councillors have turned around to look at the advisors to see whether they can nod at something I've said, to see if it's okay to agree with a particular point about radical or alternative economics, because they're so unsure of whether this is okay. Because neoliberalism directs what everyone thinks. David Harvey said it a few years ago. He said everyone thinks like a neoliberal, whether we like it or not. And so we have to kind of break that neoliberal groupthink in our own institutions, because those community wealth building ideas are perfectly suited to places like Northern Ireland. Perfectly suited for getting all of our anchor institutions up, whether it's from universities or the local government, to change the way they spend their money, progressive procurement. If they're going to procure, make sure the firm is living wage, make sure it's unionised. If they have the option, give it to a co-op. Those are all simple things that can be done. The other thing I think we need to look at, it was in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago, actually, by Joe Guinan from the Democracy Collaborative, is seriously thinking about, Roosevelt did it back in the 30s, a state holding company for North of Ireland to be set up and to buy up or to look after all of the thousands of SMEs that are about to go out of business, and hold them and care for them and look after them, and when it's appropriate to relaunch them as part of the Green New Deal, whether you relaunch them as worker co-ops, as social enterprises, as social cooperatives, all of those new green jobs we're looking at. Well, this could be that kind of springboard for allowing that to happen. I appreciate and understand how difficult doing anything like that is in this place, though. So I don't hold out much hope, but the ideas and the concept of building kind of utopias now is there, and we should really be looking at them, particularly if we're trying to provide people with a different vision of the future.
Do you want to come back in there, Chris?
Yeah, just a very small point. I suppose another light of hope in recent times has been the medical solidarity. We've seen not just the Cuban doctors, obviously, who've received lots of media attention, but even Chinese doctors. Chinese doctors have travelled to Palestine, to North Africa, even to large parts of Latin America, not only to deal with COVID, but in a number of sort of affiliated areas. I think there's a real opportunity to go beyond that now and say we need to see the decommodification of medicines in general. The World Health Organization have made a big plea for the vaccine to be made available in public common, so that we can put this, the formula out, and different countries can do that, so it's not put onto the private market, and we know inevitably what will happen. And there's a big opportunity, I think, there, not just in dealing with this, but to go on then in AIDS and all the rest of it. And then just finally, I suppose, and there's a growing campaign then to get, especially the Cuban medical doctors and their efforts recognised for the Nobel Peace Prize this year, which I think would be a very fitting way and to mark that type of solidarity.
That's great, Chris. Thank you very much, all of you. I'd like to thank you all for speaking on tonight. I'd like to thank our panellists, Claire Bailey, Chris Hazzard and Stiofan O'Neill. And just to pick up on something that you all said, is that essentially hope comes from agency and action. It's probably the issue that those declarations of climate emergencies can be quite disingenuous and quite deflating for populations that say, well, Belfast City Council declared a climate emergency last September, but what's it done? And so there's an issue about moving to action. But Stevie, do you want to come in there before I finally sign off?
Well, on what? Sorry, John. I wasn't listening to you there. I was actually looking at my phone.
Oh, sorry. No, I just thought you had some pithy firebrand slogan to send us off with. If you don't worry.
No, you're dead on. I mean, I know that I don't want to bang on about it because everyone's mentioned it a lot. But for me, one of the learnings from 2008 and from this one is if we're going to build an alternative, whether it's electoral, whether it's social movements, whether it's working with direct action, as you said, which is really important, that kind of extra parliamentary politics, as well as electoralism being a tactic of something broader rather than being where all of our focus is, which seems to be the model for the left across most of the world, is that political education is really crucial to that. And really is one of the failures of Sanders and one of the failures of Corbyn's is that the people in the wrong party, they didn't understand they were in a party that's being directed by a particular kind of Labour imperialism for 100 years. And they thought they were going to create this great democratic socialist party without understanding the nature of their own right wing. Now, political education would have solved that for them. They'd have known that if there'd have been, and one of the reasons why most parties, and I'm pointing the fingers at my two comrades in front of me, one of the reasons why most parties don't do political education is, one, they get obsessed with the electoral cycle. I get that, I understand that, but political education always falls off the agenda, and it really shouldn't, because it's too important. If we want to build left hegemony, if we want to make people understand the world through a green-red lens, then we have to do that. Otherwise, they're going to be presented with neoliberalism in our universities, in our schools, through the curricula, on the TV, on the media. So we have to provide that alternative way of understanding the world. No one else is going to do it.
That's great. Thank you, Stiofan. I want to leave you with three thoughts before we sign off. One is, in listening to you all, I can't help but think of an old Green Movement slogan, particularly in relation to community wealth building, the relocalization of the economy, is acting local while thinking global. I think that's, the idea of digging where you stand, of having these, municipal socialist experiments. Let's call them for what they are. That's what Cleveland and Preston and North Ayrshire are. But actually, we also see the beginnings, perhaps, of reversing a slogan that many of us know. It's that now we can maybe imagine the beginning of the end of capitalism as opposed to the end of the world. That idea of the capitalist realist, that we're all neoliberal, there might be an opening there in terms of what we're seeing now. So listen, folks, I wish you all a good evening. Stay safe and socially distance from neoliberalism, or if you're listening in the Republic of Ireland, socially distance from Leo-liberalism. Thanks very much now, and good night.